The carriage jolted hard over a broken stone, and Alara Whitmore gripped the seat with both hands, her heart pounding against her ribs. Outside the window, torches lined a long gravel path leading toward a house so large it looked like it belonged to another world. She was not supposed to be here yet. Not like this. Not dressed in a plain gray wool dress with her hair pinned back under a simple cap, carrying a small bag instead of a trunk full of silk gowns. She was supposed to arrive in 3 days, announced, greeted, welcomed as the future wife of Duke Ashford Sinclair. Instead, she had left her family's carriage 2 miles back, changed her clothes behind a hedge, and walked the rest of the way alone in the cold evening air, her real gown folded and hidden inside her bag. She needed to see him before he saw her. She needed to know what kind of man she was about to marry, without the mask that came with titles and formal introductions. Everyone in her family had told her the Duke was fair, generous, respected by his tenants. But she had also heard whispers, quiet and careful, that his first engagement had ended badly, that the woman had fled in the night and never spoken of him again. No one knew why. Alara refused to walk blindly into a marriage built on rumors she could not confirm. The carriage stopped at the servants' entrance, exactly where she had asked the driver to leave her. She stepped down, smoothed her skirt, and took a breath that shook more than she wanted it to. A woman in a dark apron was waiting by the door, arms crossed, eyes sharp and assessing. "You're the new girl from the agency," the woman said. It was not a question. Alara nodded quickly. She had sent a letter under a false name 2 weeks earlier, claiming to be a maid seeking work, using a reference she had quietly arranged through a former nurse who owed her family a favor. "Yes, ma'am. Alara Hart," she said, catching herself just before her real surname slipped out. The woman studied her for a long moment, taking in her plain dress, her nervous hands, the way she stood a little too straight for someone used to hard labor. Alara forced her shoulders to drop, tried to look smaller, less certain of herself. "I'm Mrs. Hartley, head housekeeper," the woman said finally. "You'll start in the kitchens. Follow me and keep your eyes down when you pass the family. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am." Alara followed her through a heavy wooden door into a narrow hallway lit by flickering lamps. The air smelled of bread and wood smoke. Somewhere deeper in the house, she could hear the faint sound of a piano, slow and melancholy, drifting through the walls like something searching for a way out. "That's the Duke playing," Mrs. Hartley said without turning around, as though she had read Alara's thoughts. "He plays most evenings. Don't go wandering toward that side of the house. The staff stay on this side unless called for." Alara said nothing, but she filed the information away carefully. The Duke played piano. No one had ever mentioned that in the letters her family exchanged with his estate. It was such a small detail, and yet it made him feel less like the cold, distant figure she had imagined and more like an actual person, someone with quiet evenings and private thoughts. The kitchen was warm and loud, filled with the clatter of pots and the quick movements of several other servants. A young woman with flour on her hands glanced up and gave Alara a small, tired smile. "New girl?" she asked. "Alara," she said, testing the shortened name on her tongue. It felt strange, wearing a piece of her own name like a disguise. "I'm Nora. You'll be washing dishes tonight most likely. Mrs. Hartley likes to see how the new ones handle a full sink before she trusts them with anything else." Alara nodded and rolled up her sleeves, grateful for something to do with her hands. As she worked, she listened. Servants, she realized quickly, knew everything. They knew who argued at breakfast, who cried in their rooms at night, who smiled only when others were watching. If she wanted the truth about the man she was meant to marry, this was exactly where she needed to be. An hour into her work, the kitchen door swung open, and a tall man stepped inside, dressed simply, without any of the formal marks of nobility that Alara expected. His dark coat was slightly wrinkled, as though he had been sitting for a long while, and his expression carried a tiredness that seemed older than his years. For a moment, no one in the kitchen moved. "Your Grace," Mrs. Hartley said quickly, straightening, "we didn't expect you down here." "I couldn't find Edmund," the man said. His voice was low, steady, without the sharp edge Alara had braced herself for. "Has anyone seen my cousin this evening?" He went to the stables not long ago, sir. The Duke nodded, his eyes sweeping briefly across the room. For half a second they landed on Alara. She kept her head down, scrubbing a plate that was already clean, her pulse loud in her ears. He did not look at her the way she feared a duke might look at a servant, dismissive or entitled. His gaze simply passed over her, distracted, distant, like a man carrying something heavy that no one else could see. Then he was gone, the door swinging shut behind him, and the kitchen exhaled as one. "That's him," Alara asked quietly before she could stop herself. Nora glanced at her, surprised by the question. Of course that's him. Who else would it be, wandering in here looking like the world sits on his shoulders? He seemed tired. "He's always like that," Nora said, lowering her voice as she leaned closer. "Ever since his engagement fell apart last year, some say the lady left him standing at the altar without a word of explanation. He hasn't been the same since. Doesn't smile much. Doesn't trust easily from what I hear, but he's fair to us. Never raises his voice. Could be worse, working for a man like that." Alara's chest tightened at the mention of the broken engagement, the very rumor she had come here to understand. She wanted to ask more, but she knew better than to push too hard on her first night. Questions asked too eagerly drew attention, and attention was the last thing she could afford. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of dishes, instructions, and unfamiliar faces. By the time Mrs. Hartley showed her to a small room she would share with another maid, Alara's arms ached and her feet throbbed inside her borrowed boots. The room was simple, 2 narrow beds, a single window, a washstand in the corner. It was nothing like the bedroom she had grown up in, with its soft linens and tall windows overlooking her family's gardens. And yet, lying down on the thin mattress, staring up at the low ceiling, Alara felt something she had not expected to feel. She felt free. For the first time in her life, no one here knew her name, her family's failing fortune, or the weight of expectation that came with being a lady meant to save her house through marriage. Here, she was simply Alara Hart, a maid who scrubbed dishes and kept her eyes down. Tomorrow she would learn more. She would watch the Duke from a distance, listen to the servants speak freely when they thought no one of consequence was near, and slowly piece together the truth about the man she was supposed to marry in a matter of weeks. She thought of his tired eyes, the slow, sad music drifting through the halls, and the way the room had gone quiet the moment he entered, not from fear, but from a kind of gentle respect she had not expected. Perhaps the rumors were wrong. Perhaps there was more to Duke Ashford Sinclair than a broken engagement and a guarded heart. Or perhaps, she thought as her eyes finally grew heavy, she was about to learn something that would break her own heart before the wedding ever took place. Outside, the piano music had stopped. The house had gone silent, wrapped in darkness and secrets, waiting for morning to arrive. Alara closed her eyes, unaware that the decision she had made tonight, to hide her identity and walk into this house as a stranger, would change the course of her life in ways she could not yet imagine. Somewhere down the hall, in a room far grander than hers, the Duke sat awake long after the music had ended, staring at a folded letter on his desk, when he had read 100 times and still could not bring himself to burn. Neither of them could have known, on that first quiet night, how close their paths were about to become, or how much pain and truth waited for them both in the weeks ahead. Morning came before the sun had fully risen, and Alara woke to the sound of Nora shaking her shoulder gently. "Up you get," Nora whispered. "Mrs. Hartley doesn't wait for sleepy girls." Alara sat up, disoriented for a moment, the ache in her arms reminding her exactly where she was and why. She dressed quickly in the same plain gray dress, tied her apron with fingers still clumsy from lack of practice, and followed Nora down to the kitchen where the fire was already crackling and the smell of fresh bread filled the air. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Alara had never known before. She scrubbed floors until her knees ached, carried heavy baskets of linen up and down narrow staircases, and learned to move quietly through hallways she was not meant to be seen in. Her hands, once soft and unmarked, grew red and raw. Her back learned the particular pain of bending over a wash basin for hours. And yet, strangely, she did not regret her choice. Every task taught her something new about the household she was soon meant to rule as its lady. She learned that the housekeeper, though strict, was fair, never punishing a mistake without first explaining how to correct it. She learned that the cook, a round-faced woman named Mrs. Doyle, hummed old songs under her breath while kneading dough and slipped extra bread to any servant who looked too thin. She learned the names of the stable boys, the gardener's habit of talking to his roses as though they could hear him, and the quiet efficiency with which the entire household moved to keep the estate running smoothly. Most of all, she learned about the Duke, though never directly from him. "He wasn't always like this," Mrs. Doyle said one afternoon, as Alara helped peel a mountain of potatoes at the long wooden table. "Before his father passed, before the trouble with his engagement, he used to laugh. I remember it well. A real laugh, not the polite sort gentlemen give at parties." "What happened?" Alara asked carefully, keeping her eyes on the potato in her hands. Mrs. Doyle glanced toward the door before lowering her voice. "The lady he was to marry left 3 days before the wedding. No letter, no explanation, just gone. Some say her family found a wealthier match. Others say she simply got frightened of the responsibility that comes with being a duchess. Either way, he never spoke of it again, locked himself away for months. Only in the last year has he started attending to his duties properly again." Alara's chest ached with a strange mixture of sympathy and unease. If a woman had truly abandoned him without a word, it would explain the guarded distance she had seen in his eyes that first night in the kitchen. It would also mean her own family's arranged marriage carried a weight she had not fully understood, the weight of a man who had already been hurt once and likely feared it happening again. She began to notice him more as the days passed, not through direct encounters, which remained rare, but through the small details other servants shared without realizing how closely she listened. He rose early before most of the household and walked the eastern gardens alone. He preferred simple meals, rarely requesting the elaborate dishes his position might have demanded. He wrote letters late into the night, and more than once, a maid mentioned finding candle wax dripped carelessly across his desk in the morning, evidence of exhaustion he never spoke about. One afternoon, while carrying a basket of freshly cut herbs from the garden back toward the kitchen, Alara turned a corner too quickly and nearly collided with someone coming from the opposite direction. She stumbled back, apologizing before she even looked up, and found herself staring directly into the Duke's face for the first time since that first night in the kitchen. "I'm terribly sorry, Your Grace," she said quickly, dropping into a hurried curtsy, her cheeks burning. He looked down at her, and for a moment something flickered across his expression, curiosity, perhaps, or mild surprise at her formal manner of speech, more refined than most servants used. She realized her mistake instantly and softened her tone, adding a touch of the plainer accent she had practiced in her room at night. "I wasn't watching where I was going, sir," she added, hoping the correction would pass unnoticed. "No harm done," he said simply. His voice up close carried a quiet warmth she had not expected, though his eyes remained guarded, careful, as though he had trained himself never to reveal too much. "You're new here?" "Yes, sir. A few days now." He studied her for a moment longer than necessary, and Alara held her breath, certain he would somehow see through her disguise, recognize something in her face that did not belong among the household staff. But instead, he simply nodded and stepped aside to let her pass. "Mind the herb garden gate," he said. "It sticks in the damp weather, wouldn't want you dropping your basket." It was such a small, ordinary kindness, the sort of thing any considerate person might say to a stranger. And yet, Alara found herself thinking about it long after she had returned to the kitchen, turning the moment over in her mind like a smooth stone. He had not spoken to her as though she were beneath his notice. He had not been cold or dismissive. He had simply been decent, in a quiet, unremarkable way that somehow felt more significant than any grand gesture. That evening, as she helped clear the family's dining room after supper, she caught sight of him again through the half-open door, seated alone at the long table long after the rest of the family had retired, staring at a letter in his hands. His cousin, a lively young man named Edmund who Alara had learned visited often, entered the room and took the seat beside him. "You're brooding again," Edmund said, his tone teasing but gentle. "I'm thinking," the Duke replied, "about the wedding." Alara froze in the hallway just outside the door, a stack of plates balanced carefully in her arms. She knew she should keep walking, that lingering to listen was dangerous, foolish even. But her feet would not move. "About obligations," the Duke said quietly. "This marriage was arranged before I had any say in the matter. My father made the agreement with her family years ago, before either of us understood what it would mean. I've never met the woman. I know nothing of her character, her temperament, whether she'll despise this house or love it, whether she'll despise me or simply tolerate me for the sake of her family's fortune." "You sound like a man walking toward his own funeral," Edmund said with a short laugh, though there was concern beneath the humor. "Perhaps I am," the Duke replied. "The last time I trusted someone with my future, she vanished without a word. I don't intend to make that mistake again, not by hoping for more than duty requires." Alara's arms trembled slightly under the weight of the plates, though it was not exhaustion causing the shake. Somewhere deep in her chest, an uncomfortable knot began to form, one she could not yet name. She continued down the hallway before anyone could notice her standing there, her mind spinning with everything she had just heard. He did not know her. Of course he did not. She had disguised herself precisely so he would not recognize her as his intended bride. But hearing him speak of the marriage as an obligation, a burden inherited from his father rather than something he desired, settled uneasily inside her. She had come here hoping to discover whether he was a good man worth marrying. She had not expected to discover that he viewed their union with the same quiet dread she had once felt herself, before she had begun, without quite realizing it, to hope for something more. That night, lying in her narrow bed while Nora slept soundly beside her, Alara stared at the ceiling and thought about the letter still clutched in the Duke's hands at dinner, about his tired eyes, about the small kindness of a warning over a sticking garden gate. She thought about her own reasons for coming here in disguise, and wondered, not for the first time, whether she had been foolish to hope that a man burdened by heartbreak and obligation could ever offer her the kind of marriage she quietly longed for. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, and somewhere in the grand house above the servants' quarters, the piano began to play again, slow and melancholy, carrying its quiet sadness through the dark hallways like a confession no one was meant to hear. 2 weeks passed, and Alara found herself settling into the rhythm of the household more comfortably than she ever imagined possible. Her hands had grown used to hard work, her feet no longer ached by the end of each day, and she had learned to move through the halls with the same quiet efficiency as the other servants. But one habit had grown stronger than any other, a habit she knew she should resist and could not. She had begun watching for the Duke. Not in any obvious way, never lingering too long or asking too many questions. But she noticed his patterns now, the early morning walks through the eastern gardens before the rest of the house stirred, the specific bench near the old stone fountain where he sometimes sat with a book he rarely seemed to read, the way he preferred solitude over company, though he was never unkind to those who approached him. It was on a cool morning, the sky still pale with the early light of dawn, that Alara found herself in the garden earlier than usual, sent to gather fresh flowers for the breakfast table. She moved carefully among the rows of blooming roses, scissors in hand, humming softly to herself, unaware that she was not alone until a quiet voice spoke from behind her. "You have a lovely voice." Alara spun around, nearly dropping her basket, to find the Duke standing a few feet away, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, an expression of mild amusement on his face, the first genuine warmth she had seen from him since her arrival. "Your Grace," she said quickly, dipping into a curtsy, her cheeks flushing warm despite the cool morning air. "I didn't realize anyone else was awake." "I often walk here before breakfast," he said. "It's quiet, peaceful before the rest of the house demands my attention." He gestured toward the roses. "You're gathering flowers for the table." "Yes, sir. Mrs. Hartley asked for something bright this morning." He nodded, studying the roses for a moment before glancing back at her. You seem to know your way around a garden better than most new maids." Alara hesitated, caught between the truth and the lie she had built her disguise upon. "My mother kept a garden," she said carefully, choosing words that were technically true, even if they concealed far more than they revealed. "I learned young." "A fortunate skill," he said. "This garden was my mother's as well before she passed. I've kept it much the same since, though I confess I've never been much good at tending it myself." There was something unguarded in the way he spoke, a rare openness that Alara suspected few people were allowed to see. She found herself wanting to ask more, to learn about the mother he mentioned so briefly, the garden he had preserved out of quiet grief. But she reminded herself gently that a maid would not press such questions, however much her heart wished to. "It's a beautiful garden, sir," she said instead. "I imagine she would be pleased to see it so well kept." Something shifted in his expression, softening further, and for a brief moment the tired weight he seemed to carry everywhere lifted just slightly from his shoulders. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Not many people think to say that." They stood together for a moment in comfortable silence, the early morning light catching the dew on the roses between them. Then, as though catching himself in a moment he had not intended to linger in, the Duke cleared his throat and took a step back. "I should let you finish your work," he said. "Forgive me for the interruption." "It was no interruption, sir," Alara said, and meant it more than she probably should have. He offered her a small nod before turning to continue his walk, and Alara stood watching him go, her heart beating a little faster than the moment seemed to warrant. She told herself it meant nothing, that a duke speaking kindly to a servant in his garden was simply good manners, nothing more. But as the days passed, these small encounters began to happen more often, and each one left her more certain that the man behind the title was nothing like the cold, distant figure the rumors had painted. Their conversations grew slowly, carefully, always brief, always confined to safe subjects. He asked about her thoughts on the roses, and she gave honest answers about which varieties thrived best in shade. She asked, once she grew bold enough, about the books he carried but rarely opened, and he admitted with a rare, wry smile that he often brought them simply for the appearance of purpose, preferring instead to sit quietly and think. "What do you think about, sir, if you don't mind my asking?" she said one morning, surprising herself with her own boldness. He considered the question longer than she expected, his gaze drifting toward the fountain. "Many things," he said finally. "My responsibilities to this estate, my tenants, my family's expectations." He paused. "Lately, an upcoming marriage that concerns me more than I care to admit." Alara's chest tightened, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "May I ask why it concerns you, sir?" He glanced at her, and for a moment she worried she had overstepped, asked a question no servant should dare voice to her employer. But instead of correcting her, he seemed almost relieved to have someone safe to speak the truth to, someone with no stake in the outcome, or so he believed. "I've never met the woman I'm meant to marry," he admitted. "The arrangement was made by our families years ago. I know nothing of her, whether she'll find happiness here, whether she'll resent the life this marriage requires of her. The last time I placed my trust in someone I was meant to marry, I was left standing alone with nothing but questions I never received answers to." "That sounds painful, sir," Alara said softly, her own heart aching with the weight of what she was hearing, knowing far more about the situation than he realized. "It was," he said simply. "I've learned to expect obligation rather than affection in matters like this. It makes the disappointment easier to bear, should it come again." Alara wanted, desperately, to tell him the truth in that moment. To confess that she was the very woman he spoke of, that she had come here not out of indifference, but out of a genuine desire to know him before their lives became permanently entwined. But fear held her tongue, fear that revealing her identity too soon would destroy whatever fragile trust had begun to grow between them, fear that he would see her disguise as a betrayal rather than an act of courage. Instead, she offered the only comfort she could, honest and careful. "Perhaps she feels the same uncertainty you do, sir. Perhaps she's simply waiting for a chance to know you as you truly are, rather than as the title everyone expects her to marry. He looked at her then, a long, searching look that made her breath catch, as though her words had touched something in him he had not expected to feel touched. "That's a kind thought," he said quietly. "I hope you're right." Their conversations continued over the following days, each one a little longer, a little more honest, until Alara found herself looking forward to the early morning garden more than any other part of her day. She learned about his love for music, the piano his mother had taught him to play before she passed, the way he found comfort in its quiet melodies during moments when words felt insufficient. She learned about his sense of duty toward his tenants, the hours he spent reviewing accounts and resolving disputes, the genuine care he held for the people under his protection, even when exhaustion weighed heavily on him. And he, in turn, learned about her, though he believed he was learning about a clever, thoughtful maid rather than the noblewoman he was contracted to marry. He learned about her love of gardens, her quiet wit, the way she asked questions that made him think more deeply about his own choices. He found himself, without quite realizing it, trusting her in a way he had not trusted anyone since the woman who had once left him standing alone. Nora noticed the change first. "You've been awfully cheerful lately," she said one afternoon, as the two of them folded linens together in the laundry room. "And you're always finding reasons to be near the East Garden in the mornings." Alara felt her cheeks warm, though she kept her eyes on the fabric in her hands. "I like the flowers there," she said, which was true if not the entire truth. Nora raised an eyebrow but said nothing further, though the knowing look on her face told Alara her secret was not as well hidden as she hoped. She resolved, quietly, to be more careful, aware that any suspicion among the staff could easily reach the wrong ears and unravel everything she had built. But even as she promised herself caution, she could not deny the warmth that had settled in her chest whenever she thought of the Duke, nor the growing fear that accompanied it. She was falling for a man who did not know her true identity, a man who spoke of his arranged marriage with quiet dread, unaware that the very woman he feared disappointing was the one he had begun, slowly and carefully, to trust. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills and painted the sky in soft shades of orange and pink, Alara found herself standing at the edge of the garden, watching the Duke's silhouette in the distance as he walked alone near the fountain. She thought about the wedding, now only a few weeks away, and the truth she still had not found the courage to reveal. She told herself she would find the right moment soon. She told herself that, when the time came, he would understand why she had done what she did, that the disguise had never been about deception for its own sake, but about a genuine desire to know the man behind the title before binding her life to his. She did not yet know that the very next conversation she overheard, one not meant for her ears at all, would shatter every hope she had begun to build, and leave her questioning whether the growing warmth between them had ever been anything more than a comfortable illusion. The night carried a strange stillness, the kind that settles over a house right before something changes it forever. Alara had been sent to collect a tray of untouched tea from the small study near the family's private quarters, a task she had done dozens of times before without incident. The door was left slightly open, a sliver of candlelight spilling into the hallway, and she might have walked past without a second thought if she had not heard the Duke's voice, low and heavy with something she had never heard in his tone before. "I can't stop thinking about her, Edmund." Alara froze mid-step, the empty tray still in her hands, her heart suddenly loud in her own ears. She knew she should walk away immediately, that whatever conversation was taking place inside that room was not meant for a servant to overhear. But her feet would not move, rooted to the floor by a mixture of fear and an aching, desperate need to understand. "You've been saying that for weeks now," Edmund's voice replied, gentler than usual, carrying none of its usual teasing edge. "Have you told her how you feel?" "How could I?" the Duke said, his voice rough with something close to grief. "It isn't that simple. There are expectations, obligations I can't simply set aside because of what I feel. My marriage is arranged. I have no right to speak of feelings for anyone else, not when I'm bound to marry a woman I've never even met." Alara's breath caught painfully in her chest. Every word landed like a blow she had not braced herself for. She had spent weeks believing, foolishly, that the quiet trust growing between them in the garden meant something real, something worth the risk she had taken by disguising herself. But here he was, speaking openly to his cousin about feelings for another woman entirely, someone who was not his arranged bride, someone he clearly wished he could pursue if only circumstances allowed. "You could still tell her," Edmund said. "Before the wedding, before it's too late to change anything." "And what good would that do?" the Duke replied, his voice cracking slightly, an unfamiliar vulnerability bleeding through his usual composure. "She's gone from my life in every way that matters now. Speaking of my feelings would only reopen a wound I've spent so long trying to close. I loved her deeply, Edmund. I still do, in ways I don't think I'll ever fully understand or explain, but loving her doesn't change the reality of my situation. I have a duty to fulfill, a marriage that must happen regardless of what my heart wants." Tears blurred Alara's vision before she even realized she was crying. She set the tray down as quietly as she could manage on a nearby table, no longer trusting her own hands not to shake it loudly enough to reveal her presence, and stepped back from the door, retreating down the hallway with quick, silent steps, her mind spinning with everything she had just heard. He loved someone else, deeply, according to his own words, a love he still carried, still grieved, even as he prepared to marry a stranger out of obligation alone. All the warmth she believed had grown between them in the garden, every honest conversation, every small kindness, suddenly felt like nothing more than the polite comfort of a man too well-mannered to be cruel to the servants around him. Nothing close to the genuine connection she had foolishly allowed herself to hope for. She made it back to her small shared room before the tears fully broke free, sinking onto the edge of her narrow bed as silent sobs shook her shoulders. Nora, thankfully, was still occupied elsewhere in the house, sparing Alara the added weight of explaining feelings she barely understood herself. How could she have been so foolish? She had come here to learn the truth about the man she was meant to marry, and she had found it, just not the truth she had hoped for. She had discovered a man capable of deep, genuine love, a love so strong it lingered even as he prepared to marry someone else entirely. And she was the someone else, the obligation standing between him and the woman he truly wanted. The cruelty of the situation struck her with fresh pain each time she turned it over in her mind. She had spent weeks growing close to a man who spoke of her, without knowing it was truly her, as nothing more than a duty to be endured. Every kind word in the garden, every honest conversation about his hopes and fears, had been offered to a maid he believed carried no stake in his heart, never once suspecting that maid was the very bride whose upcoming marriage caused him such quiet grief. She thought of her own family, waiting eagerly for news of a successful match, believing this marriage would restore their fading fortune and secure her future. She thought of the wedding, now only weeks away, and the prospect of standing before her family and his, bound for life to a man whose heart already belonged to someone else. The thought made her stomach turn with a grief she had not expected to feel this deeply, not for a marriage she had originally approached with caution and doubt, but now mourned as though she were losing something precious she had only just begun to hold. Sleep did not come easily that night. Alara lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word of the conversation she had overheard, searching for some detail that might soften the blow, some misunderstanding that might explain his words differently. But no matter how she turned it over, the conclusion remained the same. The Duke loved another woman, and she in disguise had spent weeks falling for a man who could never truly belong to her. The next morning, she avoided the eastern garden entirely, choosing instead to busy herself with tasks deep within the house where there was no risk of encountering him. Nora noticed the change in her mood immediately, though Alara offered only vague excuses about feeling unwell, unwilling to explain the true source of her sudden withdrawal. "You've barely spoken all morning," Nora said gently, as they worked together polishing silverware in the small pantry. "Did something happen?" "I'm simply tired," Alara said, forcing a small smile that did not reach her eyes. "It's been a long few weeks." Nora did not press further, though her expression carried a quiet concern that Alara appreciated even as she deflected it. She could not explain the truth, not without revealing everything she had worked so hard to conceal. And even if she could explain, she was not certain she had the strength to speak the words aloud, to admit how deeply the overheard conversation had wounded her. Over the following days, Alara withdrew further into herself, completing her duties with mechanical precision while avoiding any situation that might bring her into contact with the Duke. When their paths crossed unavoidably in the hallways, she kept her eyes lowered, her responses brief and formal, careful to give no indication of the turmoil churning beneath her calm exterior. The Duke, for his part, seemed to notice the change as well, though he could not have understood its true cause. On the rare occasions their eyes met across a room, Alara caught a flicker of confusion in his expression, as though he sensed something had shifted between them but could not identify what had caused it. She told herself it did not matter, that whatever brief connection they had shared in the garden was never real to begin with, simply a servant's fantasy built upon a man's ordinary politeness. But even as she tried to convince herself of this, a small, stubborn part of her heart refused to fully believe it. There had been something genuine in the way he spoke to her, something that felt different from mere courtesy. She could not reconcile that memory with the grief-filled confession she had overheard, and the contradiction left her more confused and heartbroken than if his words had simply confirmed the cold, distant reputation she had originally feared. By the end of the week, Alara had made a decision. She could not continue this disguise, not now, not with her heart in such turmoil and the wedding drawing steadily closer. She needed to write to her family, to explain, however vaguely she could manage, that she had discovered troubling information about her intended match, information that made her question whether this marriage could ever bring either of them genuine happiness. She sat at the small writing desk in her shared room late one night, a single candle flickering beside her, and began drafting a letter to her father, her hand trembling slightly as she chose her words carefully, unwilling to reveal the full truth of her disguise even to her own family. "Father," she wrote, "I have learned troubling things about my intended husband during my time observing the household discreetly. I believe his heart remains committed elsewhere, and I fear proceeding with this marriage would bring unhappiness to us both. I ask that you consider whether there might be another path forward, one that does not require binding two unwilling hearts together for the sake of family obligation alone." She stared at the words for a long moment before folding the letter carefully and sealing it, uncertain whether she would truly send it or whether morning light might bring a change of heart. But as she extinguished the candle and settled into bed, staring into the darkness above her, she felt no such change coming. Only a quiet, aching certainty that whatever future she had once imagined for herself, and the Duke had crumbled the moment she overheard those words spoken in grief-filled honesty to his cousin. She did not yet know how deeply she had misunderstood what she heard, nor how much pain that misunderstanding would cause before the truth finally found its way to light. The letter sat unsent on Alara's writing desk for 3 days, folded and sealed, waiting for a courage she could not quite gather to send it. Each morning she considered slipping it into the outgoing mail bag that Mrs. Hartley collected from the servants who occasionally wrote home, and each morning she hesitated, uncertain whether ending the engagement through a vague, half-honest letter was truly the right path forward. Meanwhile, the household around her continued its steady rhythm, unaware of the quiet storm building within one of its newest maids. Alara buried herself in work, taking on extra tasks whenever possible, scrubbing floors that did not need scrubbing and mending linens long past midnight. Anything to keep her hands and mind occupied enough to avoid dwelling on the ache that had settled permanently in her chest. Nora watched her friend's withdrawal with growing concern, though she respected Alara's reluctance to explain its cause. "You'll wear yourself thin," she said one evening, finding Alara still awake, mending a torn apron by candlelight long after the rest of the household had retired. "Whatever's troubling you, it isn't worth losing sleep over every single night." "I'm managing well enough," Alara replied, though her tired eyes told a different story. "You've stopped going to the garden," Nora observed quietly. "I noticed." Alara's hands stilled over the fabric in her lap. "It's simply easier to stay away," she admitted, choosing her words carefully. "Some things are better left as pleasant memories than continued habits." Nora studied her for a long moment, clearly wanting to press further but sensing the boundary Alara had drawn around the subject. Instead, she reached over and gently squeezed her friend's hand. "Whatever it is, I hope it resolves itself soon. You deserve some peace, Alara." "Everyone does." The kindness in Nora's words brought fresh tears to Alara's eyes, though she blinked them back before they could fall. She had grown genuinely fond of Nora during her weeks in the household, fond of the entire staff who had welcomed her without question, never suspecting the truth of who she really was. Leaving them when the time inevitably came would carry its own quiet grief, separate from the heartbreak surrounding the Duke. Across the house, in his private study, the Duke had noticed the change in the new maid as well, though he could not have explained why her sudden withdrawal affected him as deeply as it did. He found himself glancing toward the eastern garden each morning, half expecting to see her among the roses, only to be met with quiet disappointment when the space remained empty. He told himself it meant nothing, that a duke had no business missing the company of a servant, however pleasant her conversation had once been. But the honesty was difficult to maintain, even in the privacy of his own thoughts. "You seem distracted," Edmund observed one afternoon, finding his cousin staring absently out the study window, rather than reviewing the estate accounts spread before him. "I'm simply tired," the Duke replied, echoing without realizing it, the exact excuse Alara had offered Nora only days earlier. Edmund raised an eyebrow but chose not to press the matter, though his knowing expression suggested he suspected more lay beneath the surface than his cousin was willing to admit. The two men worked in silence for a while longer before Edmund spoke again, his tone more serious. "The wedding approaches quickly now. Have you given any further thought to what you'll say to her once she arrives?" The Duke set down his pen, rubbing a tired hand across his face. "I've thought of little else," he admitted. "I want to offer her honesty at least. She deserves that much, whatever her feelings about this arrangement might be. I won't pretend affection I don't yet feel, but neither will I treat her with the coldness this situation might tempt a lesser man toward. She's done nothing to deserve resentment, whatever grief I carry from my own past." "That's more generous than many men in your position would manage," Edmund said quietly. "Perhaps," the Duke replied. "Or perhaps I simply understand better than most what it feels like to enter a marriage without the comfort of genuine choice. I won't add to her burden by making her feel unwelcome in her own future home." Had Alara been present to hear these words, she might have found some comfort in them, some evidence that the man she had grown to admire in the garden was not entirely lost to grief and obligation alone. But she remained unaware, buried in her own assumptions, convinced that his heart belonged irrevocably to another woman, leaving no room for the hope she had once, foolishly, allowed herself to feel. 4 days after overhearing the painful conversation, Alara finally gathered the courage to send her letter home. She slipped it into the outgoing mail bag early one morning before the rest of the household stirred, her heart heavy with the weight of a decision she was not entirely certain she wanted to follow through on, but felt increasingly unable to avoid. The response, when it came nearly a week later, was not what she expected. Her father's letter arrived not through the post, but through her father himself, who traveled unannounced to the estate under the guise of a social visit, using his standing acquaintance with the Duke's late father as reasonable explanation for the sudden appearance. Alara learned of his arrival only when Mrs. Hartley mentioned, in passing, that a Lord Whitmore had come to call upon the Duke, sending the entire household into a flurry of preparation for an unexpected guest. Alara's stomach dropped the moment she heard the name. She had not expected her father to travel here in person, had not considered the very real danger his visit posed to the disguise she had maintained so carefully for weeks. If her father saw her among the household staff, dressed in her plain maid's uniform, there would be no explaining away the truth, not to the Duke, not to anyone. She spent the following hours in a state of quiet panic, finding excuses to remain in the kitchens and laundry rooms, far from any area her father might wander through during his visit. She caught only glimpses of him through windows and half-open doors, his familiar figure moving through the grand entrance hall alongside the Duke, both men engaged in polite, formal conversation that Alara could not hear clearly enough to understand its purpose. It was Nora who eventually found her hiding in the linen closet, ostensibly organizing shelves that required no organizing. "There you are," Nora said, slightly out of breath. "Mrs. Hartley's looking for you. Says the visiting lord requested tea be brought to the study, and she wants an extra hand carrying the tray." Alara's blood ran cold. "Surely someone else could manage it," she said quickly, her voice tight with barely concealed panic. Nora frowned, clearly noticing her friend's unusual reluctance. "Everyone else is occupied preparing the guest rooms. It's only a tea tray, Alara. It won't take but a moment." There was no reasonable way to refuse without raising suspicion, and Alara knew it. With trembling hands, she smoothed her apron, pulled her cap lower over her forehead, and followed Nora toward the kitchen to collect the prepared tray, her mind racing through every possible way the encounter might unfold, none of them offering any comfort. She entered the study with her eyes fixed carefully downward, setting the tray upon the small table between the two men with practiced, careful movements, praying silently that her father's attention remained fixed on his conversation with the Duke, rather than on the maid serving them. For one agonizing moment, as she straightened from placing the tray, her eyes met her father's across the room. She watched, heart pounding, as recognition flickered briefly across his features, his expression shifting from polite conversation to startled confusion in the span of a single breath. But to her immense relief, years of aristocratic training in maintaining composure served him well. He gave no outward sign of recognition beyond that single flicker, his expression smoothing quickly back into polite neutrality as he returned his attention to the Duke. Alara curtsied and retreated from the room as quickly as propriety allowed, her heart hammering so loudly she feared it might be audible to anyone standing nearby. She made it back to the kitchen and leaned heavily against the wall just outside, taking several shaking breaths to steady herself. Her father knew. There was no doubt in her mind that he had recognized her, disguise or not. A father's eyes rarely failed to see through even the most careful transformation of his own child. The question now was what he intended to do with that knowledge, whether he would expose her disguise to the Duke immediately, or allow her the chance to explain herself first. She did not have to wait long for her answer. Less than an hour later, Mrs. Hartley found her in the kitchen, informing her, with visible confusion, that the visiting lord had specifically requested a private word with the new maid before his departure. Alara followed the housekeeper's directions to a small sitting room near the front of the house, her stomach twisted into anxious knots with every step. She found her father waiting alone, his expression a complicated mixture of concern, confusion, and something close to disappointment that struck her harder than outright anger might have. "Alara," he said quietly, the moment the door closed behind her, "what in heaven's name are you doing here dressed like this?" "Father, I can explain," she began, though she was not entirely certain, even now, how to condense weeks of careful reasoning into an explanation that would satisfy him. "You certainly will," he said, though his tone carried more worry than command. "I received your letter, Alara. Troubling news about the Duke's character, you said, information gathered through discreet observation. I assumed you meant conversations with acquaintances, perhaps correspondence with someone in his circle. I did not imagine you meant you had disguised yourself as a servant in his own household. I needed to know the truth about him before committing my entire future to a stranger," Alara said, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of weeks of accumulated emotion finally finding release. "I couldn't simply trust rumors and formal introductions, Father. I needed to see him as he truly is, not as he presents himself to visiting dignitaries and marriage negotiations." Her father studied her for a long moment, his expression softening slightly, though concern remained heavy in his features. "And what did you learn in your weeks of careful observation?" Alara's eyes filled with tears she could no longer hold back. "I learned that he's kind and thoughtful and carries more grief than anyone deserves," she said. "And I learned that his heart belongs to someone else entirely, someone he still loves deeply, even as he prepares to marry me out of obligation alone." Her father's expression shifted into something gentler, understanding dawning slowly across his features. "Oh, my dear girl," he said softly, "is that truly what troubled your letter?" "I overheard him speaking with his cousin," Alara continued, the words spilling out now that she had finally begun. "He said he loved her deeply, that he still does, that speaking of his feelings would only reopen old wounds. He called our marriage nothing more than duty and obligation. How can I marry a man whose heart so clearly belongs to another, father? How can either of us find happiness in such an arrangement?" Her father was quiet for a long moment, studying her tear-streaked face with an expression she could not quite interpret. "Alara," he said finally, "are you certain you understood the entirety of what you overheard? Conversations caught in fragments often carry meanings quite different from what a full context would reveal." "I heard enough," she insisted, though a small, uncertain part of her wondered, for the first time, whether her father's question carried more wisdom than she wanted to admit. "Perhaps," her father said gently, "or perhaps you've allowed a partial truth to cause pain that a fuller understanding might have prevented entirely. Regardless, this disguise cannot continue, Alara. It was a bold choice, and I understand the impulse behind it, but it must end now, one way or another, before circumstances grow more complicated than they already are." Alara nodded slowly, wiping the tears from her cheeks, though the ache in her chest remained heavy and unresolved. "What should I do, father?" "For now," he said, "return to your duties and say nothing. I will not expose your secret without your consent, but you must decide soon how you intend to proceed, whether to reveal yourself on your own terms or allow circumstances to force the revelation for you. Either way, my dear, the truth cannot remain hidden much longer." He left shortly after, his carriage disappearing down the long gravel drive as the afternoon light began to fade, leaving Alara standing at the window, watching him go, her heart caught between the relief of a shared secret and the growing dread of a truth that now felt inevitable, waiting to unravel everything she had carefully built during her weeks in disguise. She did not yet know that the unraveling would come far sooner than she expected, nor that it would arrive not through her own confession, but through a small, forgotten locket that would finally bring the entire truth into the light. 3 days after her father's departure, Alara's careful world of secrets began to crumble in a way she had not anticipated. It started with something as small and simple as a missing button. She had been mending a small tear in her second dress, the only other garment she had brought with her disguised as a maid's spare uniform, when she realized the small silver locket she always kept pinned inside the lining had come loose sometime during her chores. The locket had belonged to her grandmother, a delicate piece engraved with the Whitmore family crest, small enough to remain hidden from casual notice, but precious enough that its loss sent a spike of panic through her chest the moment she discovered it missing. She searched her room thoroughly, then retraced her steps through the areas she had worked that day, growing more anxious with each empty search. The locket carried no explicit statement of her identity, but the crest engraved upon its surface was distinctive enough that anyone familiar with noble families might recognize its significance, particularly a household preparing to welcome a bride from that very family. Her fears proved justified far sooner than she expected. The following morning, as she went about her usual duties in the kitchen, Mrs. Hartley approached her with an expression Alara had never seen the housekeeper wear before, a careful blend of confusion and suspicion that immediately set her nerves on edge. "His Grace wishes to speak with you," Mrs. Hartley said, her tone unusually formal. "In his study." "Immediately." Alara's stomach dropped, a cold certainty settling over her even before she asked the question that hardly needed asking. "Did something happen, ma'am?" "That's not for me to say," Mrs. Hartley replied, though her expression suggested she suspected exactly what awaited Alara in that study. Best not to keep him waiting. Alara removed her apron with trembling hands, smoothing her dress as best she could before making the long walk toward the Duke's private study, her mind racing through every possible explanation, every desperate hope that this summons carried some innocent purpose entirely unrelated to her carefully guarded secret. But deep down, she already knew the truth, could feel it settling over her like a physical weight with each step closer to the study door. She knocked softly, and his voice, tense in a way she had not heard before, called for her to enter. The Duke stood near his desk, not seated as he usually was during their occasional conversations, his posture rigid, his expression carefully controlled in a way that told her he was working hard to contain emotions he did not fully understand yet. On the desk before him lay the small silver locket, its chain coiled beside it, the family crest catching the afternoon light streaming through the window. "This was found in the eastern garden this morning," he said, his voice carefully measured. "Near the fountain, where you and I have spoken on several occasions." Mrs. Hartley recognized the crest immediately. "It belongs to the Whitmore family, does it not?" Alara's throat tightened painfully, every carefully constructed excuse dying before it could reach her lips. She stood silently for a long moment, the weight of the truth pressing down upon her, until she could no longer bear the silence between them. "Yes," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "It belongs to my family." "Your family," he repeated slowly, something dawning in his expression that mixed confusion with a growing, dreadful understanding. "Alara Hart was it, a maid recently hired through an agency with no known connection to nobility." "That was never my full name," she admitted, tears already threatening at the corners of her eyes. "My name is Alara Whitmore." The silence that followed felt endless, the Duke's expression shifting through disbelief, realization, and finally something closer to shock as the full weight of her words settled over him. "Whitmore," he repeated, his voice tight. "You're the woman I'm meant to marry." "Yes," she said, tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks. "I am." He turned away from her briefly, running a hand through his hair, clearly struggling to process the revelation unfolding before him. When he turned back, his expression carried a complicated mixture of hurt and confusion that struck Alara more painfully than outright anger might have. "Why?" he asked simply. "Why would you disguise yourself as a servant in my own household? Why deceive me this way, for weeks, allowing me to speak with you as though you were simply a maid, sharing thoughts and conversations I never intended for the ears of my future wife?" "I needed to know you," Alara said, her voice breaking slightly with the effort of finally speaking the full truth after so many weeks of careful concealment. "Our marriage was arranged before either of us had any say in the matter. I couldn't bear the thought of binding my entire future to a stranger without understanding who you truly were beneath the formal introductions and negotiated agreements. I wanted to know if you were kind, if you were honest, if there was any chance we might build something genuine together, rather than simply enduring an obligation neither of us chose." "And what did you discover?" he asked, his voice quieter now, though still carrying the sting of betrayal. "I discovered that you were kind," she said honestly. "Thoughtful and gentle, and carrying more grief than I expected from the rumors I'd heard before arriving. I began to hope, foolishly perhaps, that our marriage might become something more than the obligation you clearly feared it would be." "Then why the sudden distance?" he asked, genuine confusion coloring his features now. "Weeks ago, our conversations felt easy, comfortable. Then, without explanation, you withdrew entirely, avoiding the garden, avoiding any contact with me at all. What changed?" Alara took a shaking breath, gathering the courage to voice the pain that had haunted her for the past 2 weeks. "I overheard you speaking with your cousin," she admitted. "Late one evening near your study. You spoke of loving someone deeply, of feelings you couldn't act upon because of your obligation to marry me. You called our arranged marriage nothing more than duty, while your heart belonged entirely to someone else." Understanding dawned slowly across the Duke's face, followed almost immediately by a look of horrified realization. "Alara," he said softly, "what exactly did you hear that night?" "Enough to understand that you loved another woman," she said, fresh tears threatening. Enough to know that our marriage, from your perspective, was simply an obligation standing between you and someone you truly wanted. The Duke closed his eyes briefly, a pained expression crossing his features before he spoke again, his voice gentle now, carrying none of the earlier tension. Ilara, the woman I spoke of that night was not a potential wife I was forced to abandon for the sake of duty. She was my sister. Ilara blinked, confusion momentarily overtaking her grief. Your sister. Lucy, he said quietly, grief evident in the simple mention of her name. She passed away 2 years ago from an illness that took her far too young. We were close, closer than most siblings, and her loss affected me more deeply than most people ever realized. The conversation you overheard, my grief over loving someone I could never have back, my fear of the obligations awaiting me in a marriage I approached without genuine choice, all of it stemmed from missing her, from wondering whether I could ever truly open my heart again after losing someone I loved so completely. The full weight of the misunderstanding crashed over Ilara with dizzying force. She had spent 2 agonizing weeks believing herself the unwanted obstacle standing between the Duke and a woman he truly loved, when in truth, his grief had never been romantic at all, simply the raw, unhealed pain of losing his beloved sister far too soon. I didn't know, she whispered, horror and relief warring within her chest. I assumed. I heard you speak of love, of feelings you couldn't act upon because of our arranged marriage, and I assumed the worst. An understandable assumption, the Duke said gently, given the fragments you overheard. I should have explained my grief more openly, rather than allowing rumors and half-heard conversations to paint a picture so far from the truth. This misunderstanding is as much my failure as yours. Ilara wiped at her tears, a fragile hope beginning to bloom amid the wreckage of the past painful weeks. Then you don't resent this marriage as deeply as I believed. The Duke considered the question carefully before answering, his expression softening as he studied her face, seeing her now, perhaps for the first time, not as a stranger bound to him by obligation, but as the same clever, thoughtful woman he had grown to genuinely enjoy speaking with in the garden each morning. I feared this marriage, he admitted honestly, because my last experience with love ended in abandonment, and my grief over Lucy left me uncertain whether I had room left in my heart for anyone else. But these past weeks, speaking with you, even believing you to be simply a maid, I found myself looking forward to our conversations more than I anticipated. I found comfort in your honesty, your thoughtfulness, the way you challenged my assumptions and made me consider my own feelings more carefully than I had in years. You mean that? Ilara asked softly, hardly daring to believe the words. I do, he said. Though I confess, learning that the maid I've grown fond of these past weeks is also the woman I'm contracted to marry leaves me feeling rather foolish for not recognizing you sooner. A small, watery laugh escaped Ilara despite the emotional weight of the conversation, relief finally breaking through weeks of accumulated grief and fear. I was rather good at disguising myself, Your Grace. Clearly, he said, a small smile finally appearing, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since her arrival. Though I imagine we have quite a lot to discuss, given the circumstances of our unusual introduction. Yes, Ilara agreed, wiping the last of her tears away. I imagine we do. They stood together in the quiet study, the afternoon light shifting slowly across the room, both of them beginning, tentatively, to understand that the painful misunderstanding of the past 2 weeks had not destroyed the fragile connection they built in the garden, but had instead cleared away the final barrier of secrecy standing between them, leaving only honesty and the genuine possibility of something real waiting to be built between 2 people who had, against all odds, already begun to fall for each other before either of them fully understood who the other truly was. News of the true identity of the new maid spread through the household with remarkable speed, though the Duke insisted the staff be informed gently, without embarrassment directed toward Ilara for the deception she had practiced among them. Mrs. Hartley, upon learning the truth, pressed a hand to her chest, and declared she should have suspected something the moment she noticed how properly the girl spoke, despite her efforts at a rougher accent. Mrs. Doyle laughed so hard she nearly dropped a tray of fresh bread, insisting she had always sensed something different about the newest kitchen girl. Nora's reaction, when Alara finally found the courage to explain everything to her closest friend among the staff, carried a complicated mixture of shock, amusement, and genuine hurt at having been deceived for so many weeks. "You could have told me," Nora said, though her tone carried more affection than anger. "I would have kept your secret." "I couldn't risk it," Alara admitted. "The fewer people who knew, the safer the disguise remained. But I never meant to hurt you with the deception, Nora. Our friendship these past weeks has been genuine, whatever name I was using." Nora studied her for a long moment before a small smile broke through her earlier frustration. "Well, I suppose I can say I was friends with a future duchess before anyone else in this house realized it." "That's not nothing." Their friendship, though initially strained by the revelation, settled quickly back into its familiar warmth, Nora even expressing quiet delight at the prospect of continuing to serve Alara, now in her true position as the household's future lady, once the wedding finally took place. The days following the revelation carried a different quality than anything Alara had experienced during her weeks in disguise. She moved from the servants' quarters into a guest suite befitting her true status, though she found herself, more often than she expected, missing the simple camaraderie of the kitchen and the easy friendships built over shared labor. The Duke, sensing her lingering fondness for the staff she had worked alongside, encouraged her to continue visiting the kitchen freely, an unusual arrangement for a future duchess, but one that spoke to his growing understanding of what genuinely mattered to her. Their conversations, once confined to careful, guarded exchanges in the early morning garden, deepened considerably now that the barrier of secrecy had been lifted. Alara learned more about Lucy, the beloved sister whose loss had shaped so much of the Duke's guarded nature, learning that she had shared Alara's own love of gardens, that the roses along the eastern path had been planted specifically in her memory after her passing. "She would have liked you," the Duke admitted one afternoon, as they walked together through the very garden where their unlikely friendship had first taken root. "Lucy always said I was too cautious, too quick to expect the worst from people. She would have found it fitting that the woman who finally broke through my guarded nature did so while disguised as a maid, teaching me a lesson in humility I clearly needed." "I hope I would have liked her as well," Alara said softly, genuinely moved by the trust he extended in sharing such personal memories with her. "She had your sense of humor," he continued, a fond, wistful expression crossing his features. "Sharp but never unkind. She would have appreciated the boldness of your plan, even as she teased me endlessly for not recognizing you sooner." Alara smiled at the image, grateful for the growing openness between them, the walls that had once kept the Duke so carefully guarded slowly giving way to genuine warmth and trust. She, too, found herself sharing more freely, explaining her own fears about the marriage, the pressure she felt from her family's fading fortune, the doubt that had driven her to such an unconventional plan in the first place. "I was terrified," she admitted one evening, as they sat together in the small sitting room where their true identities had first been revealed. "Terrified of becoming nothing more than a solution to my family's financial troubles, married to a man who saw me as an obligation rather than a person. I needed to know there was more to you than the title and the arrangement, that there was a chance for genuine happiness between us, however small that chance might have seemed." "And do you believe that chance exists now?" the Duke asked quietly, his eyes searching hers with a vulnerability she had rarely seen from him. "I do," Alara said without hesitation, "more than I ever expected to given how we began." He reached for her hand then, a simple gesture that carried more weight than any grand declaration might have managed. "I confess, I approached this marriage expecting little beyond dutiful cooperation. I never imagined I would find genuine affection, let alone something that feels remarkably close to the beginnings of real love. Your disguise, foolish and dangerous as it was, gave me something I desperately needed, the chance to know you honestly, without the formal barriers our positions usually demand." It was reckless, Alara admitted, though a small smile tugged at her lips. My father certainly thought so when he discovered me serving tea in your study. The Duke laughed, a genuine, warm sound that Alara realized she had rarely heard from him before this moment. I imagine that conversation was rather uncomfortable for you. Exceedingly, she confirmed, laughing along with him despite the earlier tension the memory carried. Though I suppose it worked out well enough in the end. Their remaining weeks before the wedding passed in a manner neither of them had anticipated when the arrangement was first made. Rather than the cold, formal preparation typical of arranged marriages between noble families, their engagement blossomed into something genuinely warm, built upon the honest foundation laid during Alara's weeks in disguise. They spent hours together, walking the gardens, discussing books, sharing memories of family members lost and family traditions cherished. The Duke introduced her properly to Edmund, who greeted her with warm amusement at having unknowingly discussed his cousin's romantic troubles in front of the very woman causing them. I owe you an apology, Edmund said with a teasing grin during their first proper introduction as future family members. Had I known the kitchen maid overhearing our late-night conversations was actually the future Duchess, I might have chosen my words more carefully. I think the misunderstanding worked out rather well in the end, Alara replied, unable to fully suppress her own amusement at the situation. Word of the unusual circumstances surrounding their engagement inevitably spread beyond the household staff, reaching wider social circles despite the family's efforts to maintain some discretion. Some among the nobility found the story scandalous, questioning the propriety of a future duchess disguising herself as a common servant. Others found it rather romantic, a refreshing departure from the typically cold, transactional nature of arranged marriages among their class. Alara's family, initially concerned about potential damage to their reputation, found their worries eased considerably by the genuine affection now evident between the couple whenever they appeared together in public. Her mother, upon her first visit to the estate following the revelation, watched her daughter and the Duke exchange quiet, private smiles across the dinner table, and declared, with evident relief, that whatever unconventional path had led them here, the result appeared far happier than she had dared hope for when the arrangement was first negotiated years earlier. As the wedding date approached, Alara found herself reflecting often on the frightened, uncertain woman who had arrived at this estate weeks earlier, disguised in a plain gray dress, terrified of binding her future to a stranger she knew nothing about. That woman could not have imagined the genuine warmth and understanding that awaited her, nor the depth of connection possible even within a marriage that began as nothing more than a business arrangement between two noble families. The Duke, too, found himself transformed by the experience, his once guarded heart slowly opening to the possibility of genuine happiness after years of grief and caution following his sister's passing and his earlier heartbreak. He no longer viewed his upcoming marriage as an obligation to be endured, but as a genuine partnership he found himself eagerly anticipating, built upon a foundation of honesty rarely found in arrangements like theirs. 2 nights before the wedding, they stood together once more in the eastern garden, the same roses that had witnessed their earliest conversations now in full, fragrant bloom around them. "I'm grateful for your courage," the Duke said quietly, watching the moonlight catch across her features. "Reckless as your plan may have been, it gave us something most arranged marriages never receive, the chance to build genuine trust before standing at the altar together." "I'm grateful you were patient enough to forgive the deception," Alara replied, "and honest enough to explain the truth behind what I overheard, rather than allowing pride to keep us apart." "We make quite a pair," he said, a warm smile spreading across his features. "Both of us guarded by our own fears, both of us finding unexpected honesty in the most unconventional circumstances." "Perhaps that's exactly what we needed," Alara said softly. "A marriage built on truth, rather than simply obligation." He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers gently through hers, and together they stood in comfortable silence beneath the moonlit sky, two people who had begun their journey as strangers bound by duty, and now stood on the edge of something far more genuine than either of them had dared to hope for when this arrangement was first negotiated years before either of them had any say in the matter. The morning of the wedding arrived bright and clear, sunlight spilling across the estate grounds in a way that felt almost deliberate, as though the season itself had chosen to bless the occasion with warmth after weeks of uncertainty and quiet turmoil. Ilara woke early, well before the household stirred to begin the day's elaborate preparations, and found herself standing at her window, looking out over the eastern garden where so much of her unlikely courtship had unfolded. She thought back to her first night in this house, arriving disguised and frightened, uncertain whether the man she was meant to marry would prove kind or cold, caring or indifferent. She could hardly reconcile that anxious, guarded version of herself with the woman standing at this window now, preparing to marry a man she had come to know deeply, honestly, in ways few brides ever had the opportunity to experience before their wedding day. Nora arrived shortly after sunrise, assigned by Mrs. Hartley to help Ilara dress for the ceremony, an arrangement that brought a smile to both their faces given how far their friendship had traveled since those early days scrubbing dishes together in the kitchen. "Nervous?" Nora asked, carefully arranging the delicate lace of Ilara's wedding gown, a garment far removed from the plain gray dress she had worn during her weeks of disguise. "A little," Ilara admitted, studying her reflection in the mirror, hardly recognizing the composed, radiant woman staring back at her. "Though not nearly as nervous as I was arriving here weeks ago, uncertain what kind of man I was walking toward." "And now you know," Nora said with a warm smile, fastening the final clasp of the gown. "Now I know," Ilara agreed softly, gratitude swelling in her chest for the unconventional path that had led her here, to this moment, prepared to marry a man she genuinely loved rather than simply a title she had been contracted to accept. The ceremony took place in the estate's grand chapel, filled with more guests than Ilara had anticipated, family members from both sides gathering to witness a union that had, despite its unusual beginning, become the subject of quiet fascination throughout their social circles. Her father stood proudly near the front, his earlier concern about her unconventional plan long since replaced by genuine happiness at seeing his daughter prepared to marry a man who clearly cherished her, rather than merely tolerating an obligation forced upon them both. As Ilara walked down the aisle, her eyes found the Duke waiting at the altar, his expression carrying none of the guarded distance she had first encountered weeks earlier in the kitchen, replaced instead by open warmth and something that looked remarkably like joy. Edmund stood beside him, a proud, amused smile on his face, no doubt still finding humor in the unusual circumstances that had brought this particular match together. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of formal vows and traditional rituals, though Ilara found herself especially moved during the moment when the officiant asked whether either party wished to add personal words beyond the traditional vows, an unusual request the Duke had specifically arranged beforehand. "I want everyone gathered here today to understand something about the woman standing beside me," the Duke said, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet chapel. "Ilara did not simply agree to marry me out of family obligation, as many arranged matches unfold. She took an extraordinary risk, disguising herself among my own household staff, determined to know my true character before committing her future to a stranger. That courage, that refusal to accept a marriage built purely on obligation and formality, taught me more about genuine partnership than any traditional courtship might have managed. I stand here today not merely fulfilling a contract negotiated years ago, but choosing, with full clarity and genuine affection, to build a life alongside a woman I deeply respect and love." A soft murmur of surprise and admiration rippled through the gathered guests, many of whom had heard whispers of the unusual circumstances surrounding the match, but had not expected such open acknowledgement during the formal ceremony itself. Ilara felt tears gathering in her eyes, moved by the public honesty of his words, so different from the guarded, distant man she had first encountered weeks earlier. When it came her turn to speak, Ilara took a steadying breath before addressing the gathered guests. I arrived at this estate weeks ago disguised as a servant, frightened of binding my future to a man I knew nothing about beyond rumors and formal negotiations. What I discovered instead was a man of genuine kindness, thoughtfulness, and quiet strength, someone who faced his own grief and uncertainty with grace, even while carrying burdens few people around him fully understood. I am grateful, more than words can properly express, that circumstances allowed us the chance to know each other honestly before standing here today. This marriage, whatever its unconventional beginning, is built upon a foundation I trust completely. The ceremony concluded with quiet applause and genuine warmth from the gathered guests, many visibly moved by the sincerity evident between the couple, so different from the cold, formal unions typical among their social class. As they exited the chapel together, now officially married, the household staff had gathered near the entrance: Mrs. Hartley, Mrs. Doyle, Nora, and dozens of others who had unknowingly worked alongside their future Duchess during her weeks of disguise, all cheering warmly as the newly married couple passed by. The celebration that followed carried none of the stiff formality typical of noble weddings. The Duke had insisted, over some initial resistance from more traditional family members, that the household staff be included in portions of the celebration, a gesture that spoke volumes about the values Alara's influence had already begun instilling within him. Nora danced happily among the guests, still occasionally shaking her head in amused disbelief at how dramatically her friend's circumstances had transformed since their days folding linens together in the servants' quarters. As evening settled over the estate, Alara and Ashford found a quiet moment alone in the eastern garden, slipping away from the celebration to stand once more among the roses that had witnessed the earliest, most fragile beginnings of their unlikely connection. "Do you remember?" Ashford said, reaching for her hand as they walked slowly along the familiar path. "The first morning we spoke here, when I complimented your voice and you nearly dropped your basket of flowers." "I remember being terrified you would somehow see through my disguise," Alara laughed softly. "Though I suppose, eventually, you did." "Not nearly soon enough," he said, a rueful smile crossing his features. "I spent weeks speaking with the woman I loved, entirely unaware she was also the woman I was contracted to marry. I've never felt quite so foolish, nor quite so grateful for that foolishness, given where it eventually led us." "I don't regret the disguise," Alara admitted, "despite the pain that misunderstanding caused us both. I needed to know you honestly, without the weight of titles and formal expectations coloring every conversation. I found something far more valuable than I expected, a genuine friendship that grew into something even deeper before either of us fully understood what was happening." "A rather unconventional courtship," Ashford said, "even by the unusual standards of arranged marriages among our class." "Perhaps," Alara agreed, smiling up at him beneath the fading evening light. "But I imagine most love stories worth telling rarely follow the conventional path entirely." They stood together in comfortable silence for a long moment, the sounds of the celebration drifting faintly from the main house behind them, the roses around them carrying the quiet, fragrant memory of every conversation, every small kindness, every honest exchange that had slowly built the foundation of genuine affection now sealed by their marriage vows. "I love you," Ashford said softly, the words carrying a weight and sincerity that filled Alara's heart with a warmth she had never quite believed she would find within an arranged marriage. "Not out of obligation, not because our families negotiated this arrangement years before we ever met, but because I have come to know you genuinely and completely, and find myself grateful every single day for the reckless courage that brought you into my household disguised as a simple maid." "I love you as well," Alara replied, her voice thick with emotion. "More deeply than I ever imagined possible, given how uncertain and frightened I was arriving here weeks ago." As darkness settled fully over the estate, the couple returned to their celebration, hand in hand, ready to begin their life together not as strangers bound by duty and family obligation, but as two people who had found genuine love through courage, honesty, and the unlikely disguise of a maid's plain gray dress. Their story, unconventional as its beginning had been, stood as proof that true partnership required more than formal introductions and negotiated contracts. It required the willingness to see beyond titles and expectations, to risk vulnerability in pursuit of genuine understanding, and to build trust honestly, however unusual the path required to reach it. In the years that followed, the story of the Duke's bride who arrived disguised as a maid became a quiet legend among their household staff and social circles alike, told and retold with growing fondness. A reminder that even arrangements born from obligation could blossom into genuine, lasting love when both parties chose honesty over pretense and courage over comfortable distance. A year passed quickly after the wedding, filled with the steady work of learning to run a household together, a partnership that looked nothing like the distant, formal marriages common among their social circle. Alara took to her new responsibilities with the same determination she had shown during her weeks of disguise, though now she approached the estate's affairs openly, sitting beside Ashford as he reviewed accounts, offering opinions he genuinely valued rather than simply tolerated. Not everyone welcomed the change with ease. Some among the older nobility whispered that a duchess who had once scrubbed floors alongside common servants lacked the proper bearing for her new position, that her time in disguise had left a lingering informality unsuited to her rank. Alara heard these whispers occasionally, carried through careful gossip at social gatherings, and found she cared far less about them than she once might have imagined. "Let them whisper," she told Ashford one evening, after a particularly pointed comment from a visiting countess about her unusually familiar manner with the household staff. "I would rather be known as a duchess who treats her staff with respect than one who commands fear and distance." "I married you precisely because you refused to accept distance as the price of your position," Ashford replied, clearly proud of the very qualities others sometimes questioned. "Their opinions matter little compared to the genuine loyalty you've earned from everyone under this roof." That loyalty proved itself repeatedly throughout their first year together. When a harsh winter threatened several tenant families with hardship, Alara organized relief efforts personally, drawing on the practical knowledge of hardship she had gained during her weeks living among the servants, understanding needs that a duchess raised entirely within aristocratic comfort might have overlooked. Mrs. Hartley and Mrs. Doyle worked alongside her, the three women coordinating supplies and support with an efficiency born from genuine understanding rather than distant charity. Nora, promoted eventually to Alara's personal attendant, remained one of her closest confidants throughout this period of adjustment, the friendship forged during those early weeks of disguise growing only stronger as their circumstances evolved. "Who would have imagined," Nora said one afternoon, helping Alara prepare for a formal dinner with visiting dignitaries, "that the frightened new maid I met scrubbing dishes would become the woman managing this entire estate's charitable efforts within a single year. I couldn't have managed any of it without everything I learned during those weeks," Alara admitted. "Understanding the household from the ground up gave me insight most duchesses never bother acquiring." Ashford, too, found himself transformed by the ongoing partnership, gradually shedding the guarded caution that had defined him since Lucy's passing and his earlier heartbreak. He laughed more freely now, spent evenings playing piano not in solitary grief, but often with Alara seated nearby, occasionally adding her own uncertain attempts at the instrument, much to their shared amusement at her admittedly limited musical talent. One autumn afternoon, nearly 14 months after their wedding, Edmund arrived for an extended visit, carrying with him a small wooden box he explained had belonged to Lucy, discovered recently while clearing out storage in the family's secondary estate. "I thought you might want these," Edmund said, presenting the box to Ashford with unusual gentleness. "Letters mostly, some sketches. I didn't feel right keeping them without showing you first." Ashford opened the box carefully that evening, Alara sitting beside him as he sorted through his sister's belongings, old letters written to friends never sent, sketches of the very garden they had walked together countless times, small fragments of a life cut short far too young. Among the papers, he found a letter addressed simply to "my future sister," dated several years before Lucy's passing, written during a period when the arranged marriage between Ashford and Alara's families had first been discussed. His hands trembled slightly as he read it aloud to Alara, Lucy's careful handwriting filling the page with hopeful, generous words meant for a sister-in-law she would never live to meet. The letter spoke of her wish that whoever eventually married her brother would help him learn to laugh again, would see past his careful guardedness to the genuinely kind heart she knew existed beneath it, would build the kind of honest partnership their own parents had modeled before their father's later, more difficult years running the estate alone. She knew, Ashford said softly, tears gathering in his eyes as he finished reading. Even before either of us existed to each other, she hoped for exactly what we've built. Alara wrapped her arms around him gently, moved beyond words by the letter's uncanny resonance with everything that had unfolded between them since her unconventional arrival at the estate. "I wish I could have known her," she said quietly. "She would have loved seeing this," Ashford replied, gesturing between them, at the life they had built together despite its unusual beginning. She always believed genuine happiness required courage, the willingness to risk vulnerability rather than hide behind formality and distance. You embodied exactly what she hoped for, long before either of us understood how deeply that hope would eventually be fulfilled. They framed the letter and hung it in the study, a permanent reminder of the sister whose memory had, however unknowingly, guided them both toward the genuine happiness they now shared. Alara visited the eastern garden often after discovering the letter, tending Lucy's roses personally alongside the estate's gardener, feeling a quiet connection to the woman whose hopeful words had proven so remarkably prophetic. As their second year of marriage approached, Alara discovered she was expecting their first child, news that brought genuine joy throughout the household, particularly among the staff who had watched their unlikely courtship unfold from its very earliest, disguised beginnings. Mrs. Doyle immediately began planning special meals suited to expectant mothers, drawing on decades of experience caring for the family through generations. Nora fussed over Alara with the protective affection of a true friend rather than simply a dutiful attendant, and Mrs. Hartley, ever practical, began quietly preparing the nursery with the same careful efficiency she brought to every household task. Ashford's protective instincts, already evident in his careful attention to Alara's well-being, grew even more pronounced during the months of her pregnancy, though he balanced genuine care with respect for her independence, never treating her condition as reason to exclude her from the estate's ongoing affairs. "You needn't hover quite so constantly," Alara teased one afternoon, finding him unusually attentive as she walked through the garden, watching her steps with careful concern. "Forgive me," he said, though his smile suggested little genuine remorse. "I simply find myself more grateful than I can properly express, for you, for this child, for everything our unconventional beginning eventually led toward." Allow an anxious husband his moments of excessive concern. Their daughter arrived the following spring. Born during the same season the roses in the eastern garden bloomed most fully, a coincidence Alara found particularly meaningful given everything those roses had witnessed during their courtship. They named her Lucy, honoring the sister whose hopeful letter had so beautifully predicted the genuine partnership her brother eventually found. Watching Ashford hold their newborn daughter for the first time, his earlier guardedness completely replaced by open, unguarded joy, Alara felt a profound gratitude for the reckless courage that had driven her, months earlier, to disguise herself as a simple maid, rather than accept a marriage built purely on formal obligation. That single choice, dangerous and unconventional as it had been, had led them both toward a happiness neither had dared to expect when their families first negotiated the arrangement years before either of them had any genuine say in the matter. The household staff gathered informally to welcome the new arrival, Mrs. Hartley declaring the baby had inherited her mother's determined spirit even in her earliest days, Mrs. Doyle already planning which special dishes she would prepare as the child grew, Nora holding the infant with careful, practiced affection, already imagining the stories she would someday tell little Lucy about her mother's remarkable disguise and the unlikely courtship that had brought her parents together. Years later, when their daughter grew old enough to ask about her parents' unusual courtship, Alara would tell the story exactly as it happened. The disguise, the misunderstanding, the painful weeks of believing her heart broken beyond repair, and the eventual truth that reunited them stronger than before. She never softened the difficult parts of their journey, believing genuine love stories required honesty about their struggles as much as celebration of their joys. "Why did you take such a risk, disguising yourself that way?" young Lucy asked one evening, curled beside her mother near the same fireplace where Ashford had once played piano alone through countless sorrowful nights. "Because I refused to accept a marriage built on formality alone," Alara told her daughter. "I wanted to know your father honestly, completely, before committing my entire future to him. It was frightening, and it caused both of us pain we didn't anticipate, but it also gave us something most arranged marriages never receive: genuine trust built through honesty rather than simply formal introduction." "And you're happy you took that risk?" Lucy asked, watching her mother with the same curious, thoughtful expression Alara recognized as an echo of her own younger self. "More than I could ever properly explain," Alara said, glancing toward the study where Ashford's laughter drifted through, deep and genuine, so different from the guarded distance that had once defined him. "Sometimes the most important truths in life require a bit of courage to uncover, my darling. Never be afraid to seek genuine understanding, even when the easier path might tempt you toward comfortable pretense instead." Outside, the eastern garden bloomed as beautifully as it always had each spring. The roses Lucy had once planted now flourishing under the careful attention of the family, who continued to honor her memory. A living reminder that genuine love, however unconventional its beginning, could flourish into something lasting and true when built upon the foundation of honesty, courage, and the willingness to truly know another person before binding one's future to theirs.